Good morning, everyone. Oh, you got to do better than that. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of your Alumni Association, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am that you're all back for reunion. I'm also amazed that you're all here at this hour, because I heard that the linebacker was hopping last night. And not that I want to throw anyone under the bus, but my house guest came in at an unacceptable hour. And I'm guessing anybody else there at the linebacker last night? No, okay, good. I won't have to give you a hard time. But I'm particularly glad that you came out to this session because it promises to be a fascinating one on a really important topic as we explore the changing and ever-expanding media landscape and all of our questions about the term that we keep hearing everywhere, fake news. And we have the perfect group of panelists to delve into it. We have Brenna Williams from the class of 2012, who is a multi-platform editor at CNN Politics and full of energy and a real dynamo. We've got Carlos Lozada from the class of 1993, although I just told him he doesn't look like he could possibly be from 93, maybe 03. And he's from the Washington Post. And we have the brilliant Tim Winiger, I think I got it right, from the College of Engineering. Leading us today is someone that may be familiar from those in the area, Diane Daniels. Diane serves as the weekend anchor at WSBT 22 News here. She has previously reported for television stations. We always share our stories about both of us doing a short stint in Bismarck, North Dakota. She was also in Des Moines, Iowa, and she's an Iowa girl, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. She lives in Granger with her son and her husband, John, who is a 1985 Notre Dame graduate. We're so grateful today that she's with us. Please welcome Diane and our panelists.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Dolly, for that introduction. And we are thrilled to be here, and we're thrilled about the conversation that we're going to have this morning. And we thought, by way of introduction, there's really no better way to get started than to just dive right into this whole fake news issue. First, though, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones if you have not already done so, out of respect for our panelists and the rest of the audience members. And also, I want to let you know we will be allowing time for your questions, and we will welcome that at the end. We've really allowed a generous, robust amount of time for that. So please hold your questions until that time, and we will be anxious to hear from you. So with that, thank you for attending, and we're just going to get started. I'm going to start with Brenna Williams, who's here on my left. As Dolly mentioned, a 2012 Notre Dame graduate. She currently works for CNN Politics. And when you and I first communicated, she said, we've just got to address the elephant in the room right away, which is how CNN is frequently perhaps one of the most highly visible targets for the fake news label. So Brenna, what has that been like for you? And I know you've worked at some other entities before the fake news label was as prominent as it is now. So tell us about your experience and maybe contrast it with some of your previous experience.
Absolutely. Well, hi, everyone. So I think that the number one way I've kind of noticed this kind of fake news label, this fake news controversy kind of impacting us is just it's an unnecessary part of the story. There's so much going on in Washington, in politics, all over the world that, why are we focusing on this instead of something else that might be going on? Another story or a niche story that might not get the, time that it deserves because we're tweeting about fake news. We're having to defend ourselves, not just CNN, but other news entities as well. And then I think that overall, President Trump, according to Leslie Stahl from CBS, even said, I call you guys fake news so that when you publish stories about me that aren't positive, no one will believe you. So I think that the news industry, the media, the fourth estate has kind of taken a hit. There are polls and things, of public polls that say that people don't trust news at large as much as they used to. And I think that that's not good, because if you don't trust the news, if I come to you and I say, I'd like to interview you for this story, I work at CNN, and you say, I don't want to talk to you because you're fake news, then I'm not hearing your story and I'm not hearing all sides, and I can't do my job as thoroughly or as well as I want to. So I think that personally, that's how it's impacted me. And I think, it's hard to compare it to other places that I've worked. I've worked at C-SPAN, I've worked at NBC News, I've had internships at other places. The story wasn't quite as Washington focused. I mean, President Obama's administration, I graduated in 2012, so I've only really worked, during the Trump and Obama administrations. Washington was a part of the story, but it wasn't everything you see on the evening news, right? Maybe there would be a DC piece, 2 DC pieces, but there was a broader thing. This is the moment, this is the story, and I think that's why there's a lot of backlash from the administration and from different people, because they don't like being in the spotlight all the time.
Sure, and that news cycle is just,
Right.
we're all struggling to keep up, that's
We've
for
missed
sure.
5 since sitting here.
Right, exactly. So we'd like to now talk more with Carlos Lozada. Carlos is experiencing his reunion year, a 93 graduate of Notre Dame. Yay! And Carlos works for the Washington Post. He is the nonfiction book critic for the Post, and he also is about to embark on his 10th year teaching a class in American political journalism for Notre Dame's Washington semester program. And he is about to tell you a fascinating story. In fact, you may want to just buckle in for this, about how
Lower
fake news,
yeah.
I don't think so, fake news very definitely impacted his teaching work at the Post. So Carlos, please take it away.
Sure. So thank you, and welcome to Reunion. My part of the story is marginal, but I hope instructive in a larger way. So you may remember last fall, there was a special Senate election in Alabama, and Doug Jones and Roy Moore were the 2 candidates, and the Washington Post reported some disturbing stories about Roy Moore when he was a younger man in his 20s and 30s, and let's say relationships he pursued with younger people. And this was a story that was broken in the Post and became a huge media sensation. And at one point, a woman approached some of my colleagues at the Washington Post who had reported on this story, and told them that she had, when she was young, she had had a relationship with Roy Moore, and she wanted to tell the story to the Washington Post. And as it turns out, this was not true. This was part of a sting operation that an organization called Project Veritas tried to launch against the Post. What they wanted to do was have us report on this woman's story, and then reveal that it was a hoax, that it wasn't true, and therefore discredit all of the reporting, including the very truthful reporting that had occurred surrounding the Roy Moore story. So fortunately, as you can imagine, my colleagues at the Post don't simply write down what someone says and stick it in the newspaper. There was a lot of vetting and fact-checking that went in, and they discovered fairly quickly who this person was and what she was attempting to do. So they wrote a story about her, and about that, and about the organization that she was a part of. And it really backfired on this effort to portray all of Washington Post reporting on this subject as untruthful, as fake. The way that affected me in my class is that it turns out this organization had been trying to infiltrate the Washington Post, going to Washington Post happy hours, posing as students, trying to come into the Post on tours, to sort of tape us and try to catch us, doing all sorts of nefarious, agenda-driven things. And so this affected the way that we allow people into the building. And I taught the course at the Washington Post for the last 9 years, which is very cool for the undergrads to come and get to hang out in the newsroom. But as of this past semester, I can no longer teach it there, because who knows if one of these students is actually fake and infiltrating the Post to videotape us surreptitiously. Now, that's no big deal for the kids in the class or for me. But it's useful to think about the effort and the attempt that went into this. Imagine that for some reason we hadn't vetted the story as carefully, or we hadn't fact-checked and found out who this person was, the women who came forward, now far older, because this happened decades ago, to tell the story of what had happened with them and Roy Moore, they would have been discredited. People would not have believed them as well. And that's really insidious when you think about it. Someone going out of their way to offer a kind of horrific personal story aimed at really discrediting other people who were putting their stories forward truthfully in order to paint the Washington Post as fake news. That was the objective of this operation. So it's not just, at the Post we have a great legal team, we can defend ourselves, we're big boys and girls. But our sources who would come forward, people who come to tell their stories, they put a lot on the line to do that. And this was an effort aimed not just at us, but at them.
All right, thank you, Carlos. A fascinating story. So I am suspecting many of you checked social media before you came today. Facebook, anybody? Probably. And many of you perhaps may have shared out an article or a link to something in the process of doing that. But did you actually read that article first? Our next guest, who is here, Tim Whittinger, is here to tell us that you probably didn't. He does research here as an assistant professor at Notre Dame on machine learning, network science, and social media and how that all works together. And I know, Tim, you have looked at some research into this during some of your work. So tell us about that, because social media plays such a huge role in the whole fake news issue.
Right, of course. So thank you very much. It's good to see you all here. I've been at Notre Dame now for finishing my 5th year, starting my 6th year. I teach in computer science and engineering. I teach databases, machine learning, and how Google works, and how information gets curated by different algorithms and machines and gets crunched and then redisplayed to users, right? And all of that, how we get information nowadays, is dependent upon, in a large part, by computers and by social media. And so your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed or your Snap, Twitter feed, it all kind of, it informs the lens through which you see the world, right? This is probably one of the most important things happening in society and technology right now. And so what I did, I was, let's say, in college. I was a PhD student 6 years ago now, and I was on, Twitter and Facebook and a website called Reddit. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, it would be really easy, I think, for a bunch of people to get together and manipulate what you could see and hear on these websites. And so I wrote a paper, and because that's what academics do. We write papers, and then we publish them, and no one reads them. And so I wrote a paper, 2012, I think it was, that I think that bad actors, and back then it was Syria and the Syrian Electronic Army, which was sponsored by some nefarious organizations, I think that they will try to influence our elections. It's like, nah, this is silly. But I wrote that down, and I published it, and then, holy crap, right? A bunch of, the last 5 years happened. And so I've been working in this area for, during this period, and we've been studying how people receive their news, how they act as editors when they upvote and share the news, right? So you all are information consumers, right? Because you read the newspaper, you read your Twitter feed, your Facebook feed, but you also are editors because you like and you share different pictures of cats along with different stories from CNN and the Washington Post. Right? 'Cause you inform the algorithm, the Googles and the Facebooks, what you believe is important. So you actually have a really big responsibility in what other people see. So I study that, and I study how this has changed from a handful of editors sitting in a newsroom at the Post or at CNN deciding what news is fit to print. Right? That's the New York Times logo. To now, we all collectively decide what news we all get to see. And so that's what I've been doing. I'm happy to share some anecdotes throughout the conversation about what we found.
All right, looking forward to it. Thank you, Tim. So we did have the opportunity to kind of brainstorm ahead of today's conversation, and we all agreed that the best place to start today was to try and define fake news. And you might think, well, that's easy, that wouldn't take long, but it really is more shades of gray and nuanced than you might expect. So we're gonna ask all of our panelists now to try and define fake news for us. And Carlos, do you wanna get us started with that?
Yes. I think the name of the panel and all that notwithstanding, it's become almost a useless term now because it means almost anything, right? Originally, when people first started using the term fake news, it was about stories that were deliberately fabricated, made up, made to look real, maybe out of some bot farm in Macedonia or something, to gain advertising revenue through clicks, right? Then during the campaign, the 2016 campaign, it sort of started, the meaning of it began mutating a little bit. And it became, news that you don't like, that doesn't conform with your points of view, or, journalists commit errors every day, right? If you open up your newspaper, you see a corrections column, and here's stuff that we got wrong, and we try to, admit it, explain what happened, and give you the right information. It's not perfect. We try to get as close to the truth as we can. And so that's not what fake news is, right? Fake news is not a legitimate, unintentional error that then you fix, right? And more recently, earlier this, is it still May or June? Yeah, earlier in May, it's June already, happy June. Early in May, President Trump, for instance, tweeted very specifically that essentially any story that was negative about him was by definition fake, right? So that's not really what we should think of as fake news either. So, conceptually, it's become very murky, very, very muddled. And, I think the challenge for us is to, if one good tip-off, is if you find yourself relying on a news source that constantly validates your biases and your pre-existing beliefs and that never deviates from that, that's a good tip-off that there's something going on there that you might want to consider, because the world doesn't actually work that way. The world doesn't exist to validate all our pre-existing biases.
Right. In academia, we don't use the term fake news anymore because it's become kind of meaningless, right? It's become a political kind of battle cry even. So instead, we study the spread of news, and then by the time it gets fact-checked, a week or two later, we say, okay, well, was this information that was spread, was it true or was it not? Right, so it was false, or it was half true, or different shades of truth, and why. I think the idea of misinformation or disinformation is purposefully misleading or incorrect stories, where someone writes a story they know is false, and there's an intent to deceive. Is where I start to think, okay, this was intentionally made to mislead. And so one of the things that we try to study is, we actually just have a paper out like yesterday that was studying how fast do these false news stories spread, either on Twitter or on Facebook, because they spread on the kind of in the digital realm. And we find that the false news, the misleading headlines, they spread much faster, right? And the reason is because things that I agree with your worldview, you'll want to share with them without investigating them really deeply. One of the things that we found is that on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Reddit, which are the three kind of big social news sites currently, we found that 75% of all shares and likes and retweets were shared without the user who shared them ever actually clicking on the article. 75% of shares happen without the user reading what they're sharing. And so, and then we all look around and wonder, so why is there so much fake news, right? It's because we collectively, and I'm guilty too, I'm just as guilty as anyone else. I actually studied myself for the past year and a half. 74%. So I'm better than all of you.
You're the 1%.
I am the 1% better. Right, so it's something that we all do and have, and that's, I think, one of the driving problems of kind of the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, so it sounds kind of like we all look at this the same way. And obviously at CNN, this is something that we think about, we talk about, and we really have put some thought into. And we think of fake news in two kind of buckets. The first are these articles that are written purposely overseas or wherever in someone's mom's basement purposely to mislead the public, to, spread misinformation, to spread whatever somebody's making up in their heads, which is actually kind of shocking because as crazy as the real news is, I think to myself, I couldn't write this stuff, and then someone writes something even crazier and spreads it even faster. And then on the other hand, like Carlos was saying, are these stories that are vetted, are sourced, are true, that someone calls fake news because they don't like it, So we definitely think about it in those two kind of camps. And I read in an article recently from CNN that the way that these kind of fake news factories work is they take a story that's kind of already happening and then they just bump it up a level, with how crazy it is, right? So they'll take something that sounds like it could be true, or take a true story and then add just a sensational tidbit to it, and that's what the headline is, right? That's what gets it shared, that's what gets it clicks, which is how they make money. They make a lot of money. $1,000 American is a lot of money in Macedonia, right? So, yeah.
So it just goes to show that you may read something and maybe 99% of it is true, but that 1% that's the crazy, sensational part that is going to set the world on fire, that part is fake news. So we all really need to be stringent news consumers, which is just one more job for all of us. But all of this begs the question, then what do you do about it? And specifically, how do news organizations address this in their day-to-day reporting to do the level best of giving you, the news consumer, what you need? Should you address it? Should you ignore it? Should you allow that to become part of the story? And perhaps that varies from news organization to news organization, and certainly varies where social media is concerned. So, Brenna, you folks at CNN, as you alluded to before, are definitely there with the target on your forehead for President Trump and often receive the critique of fake news from him. How do you guys typically handle that, and how does CNN typically handle that?
Well, I mean, it's not just President Trump. It's a lot of different people.
Sure.
We're a frequent target of the entire administration, of a lot of different sources for a lot of different stories. President Trump's voice just happens to be very loud, so that's why it's a prime example. I can't speak, obviously for the entire organization. I will say, when we get something wrong, which sometimes happens, we correct it as fast as possible and we explain what happened. We're honest with our mistakes. We go to work every day like you guys do, and we try to do our best. And, you guys all went to Notre Dame, so I'm sure that very rarely do you get anything wrong. But when you do, you fix it. And that's something that I think we learn here at Notre Dame is to, walk through life with integrity, admit when we're wrong, do our best, and fix things. And I think that that's what we do whenever we get something wrong. As far as, when we're called fake news, how do you even keep track of it? I think we address it when it's, a story that, is very important to the news cycle. If it's something that we're breaking, that we really need to correct the record, but there's no way, there's not enough hours in the day to address every time someone calls us fake news. All we can do is put our reporting out there and be clear and open when we do get something wrong, so that if you read something and it's called fake news and we haven't corrected it, hopefully you've seen us atone for our sins in the past, and that we wouldn't cover anything up, because we're human. We're just trying to get the truth out there. We're just trying to tell these stories, and we're just trying to move on every day.
It really draws the media in to potentially be part of the story, and it's a very delicate balancing act. I know, Carlos, you mentioned at the Post, your superiors say, we're not at war, we're at work. Explain a little bit about that mindset in trying to soldier through the fake news era.
Yeah. Throughout, and I agree with Brenna in the sense that this is not solely a sort of Trump story, a President Trump story. He just has the biggest megaphone and has popularized this term in a big way. I think the worst thing we could do in the mainstream media is to buy into this notion that we're some kind of opposition to this president or to this administration. That's not how we go to work every day. I think people forget, for instance, the New York Times, right? The failing New York Times is painted as sort of the most liberal news organization in America. They broke the Hillary Clinton email story and wrote it like crazy. That was their story. That was the New York Times story. You wouldn't have known that without the New York Times. I think that's something that's useful to remember. The bias in journalism is not towards left or towards right or pro or anti-Trump. It's towards revelation, towards conflict. That's sort of the stuff of great literature, the stuff of great journalism. It's not left-right is kind of boring compared to that. And so Marty Baron, our executive editor, who some of you may know as from the movie Spotlight, who was the editor of the Boston Globe at the time. He's now our editor, and that's his line, that we're not at war, we're at work. And if we buy into this notion that we're the opposition party, that we're out to take somebody down, it undermines the credibility of all our work. And something is interesting is that this is not just an American story. The United States has long been this sort of beacon of press freedom. The press is the only sort of specific industry and profession mentioned in the Bill of Rights, right? Like freedom of the press, it's in the First Amendment. But you see now with the fake news moniker being so popular in the United States, you see Bashar al-Assad in Syria dismissing human rights reports about his country as fake news. You see Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines doing the same thing. You see President Maduro in Venezuela dismissing investigative reporting about him as fake news. This megaphone is not just inward, it's not just our conversation. And so that's one of the things that's very, very dangerous about fake news. The stakes in the United States are high. The stakes in other countries where press freedoms are really under attack are far more significant. Fake news has become this sort of weapon that's deployed. And it's deployed in the United States, but now it's being increasingly deployed around the world.
Carlos, earlier, just this week, I had read, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, that the fallout of fake news globally in 2017 ended with at least 21 journalists worldwide being imprisoned. I think that really speaks to what you're talking about, that this is not just an American problem, it's a growing global problem. And Tim, I suspect part of that is because of social media, that our media goes everywhere now.
Right, so one of the things that happens with social media and the technology that's involved is that these... Can you hear me now?
You always wanted to say that.
Been waiting 30 years. One of the things that happens in the era of social media and with the technology, we instantly share our opinions on something when we comment and when we vote, and social media systems like the Facebooks and the Instagrams and so on, they have, I think, a responsibility here to help kind of curate factual information, not just because it's societally important to do, but it's good for their bottom line, right? People go to these social media sites to get information. Now, I think most of it is to get information because we want photos of our grandchildren or to see what our families are doing who've moved away. But that's the big utility, but it's also to get information from all over the world, right? And sometimes, because we aren't always critical with what we share and like, the social media systems will show an article, or at least a headline, that is not true, just factually untrue. So social media systems are trying their very best, but they're having a really hard time at this. So for example, one of the big social media systems tried an experiment where they tagged this news as false. So hey, this is something that we're not going to hide it from you, but we'll say, hey, this has been disputed. And so there'll be a little red box around it, it'll say disputed. Right? And so they had an experiment with a few thousand of their folks. And what ended up happening is after running this experiment for a few months, they found that people who were in that experiment were actually more apt, more likely to believe in false news stories. Well, why is that? Well, it turns out that it takes a few days for a news to get fact-checked. And so by the time that little red box appears around an article, it's already it's too late. And so the human, the person who's reading the news, then says, okay, anything that has a red box around it, I shouldn't trust. Anything else that doesn't have that box around it must be true. When really, it just hasn't been verified. It hasn't been checked yet. And so people were abdicating their critical higher thinking skills to the algorithm, and it was making them more likely to believe in stories that were false, but just not yet checked. Right? And so we're having a hard time figuring this out because it's tough. And I think it relies not partially on the algorithm, partially on the social news service, but also on all of us. We have to be more cognizant, be more careful, and think more critically with the news that we share.
I think it's kind of a good opportunity, right? Like, our jobs are pretty cool. So everybody at home, you can be journalists too. We all vet our sources, like, Carlos was saying, and we verify that what they're saying is true. We fact check everything to the best of our abilities. You can do the same thing with the news sites that you're reading. You can look into them. You can see where they're originating. You can look up the writers. You can do your own research a little bit. We try to fact check different things and point out, like I said, when we are wrong. But if you aren't sure about something, you can always go deeper. The internet is bottomless.
One of the things that has been shown to work is that if let's say Carlos shares something that is just incorrect, this never happened before, but let's say that he shares something that is just wrong. One thing that has been shown is if I comment on it, and if I comment the Snopes or the FactCheck.com or the PolitiFact or whatever, the fact-checking that disputes that, people are more likely to discount it because someone that you trust, your friend or whatever on Facebook or Instagram, has disputed it with a source. That has been shown to work. Now, what doesn't work, what actually makes it worse, is if you confront the person by saying, this is wrong, you should feel bad you should feel bad about it. That actually makes the person who shared it more likely to be more deeply entrenched. Right? So if you believe that the Red Sox are just the best baseball team in the world, and then you show them indisputable evidence that the Yankees are indeed better, right? Not only will the Red Sox fan not believe you, they will become more of a Red Sox fan. It's called the backfire effect. And so just simply, here's the link to the fact check, and that's it. And that's been shown to work pretty well to dispute the spread of, and kind of to dampen the spread of misinformation.
So really the days of being a passive news consumer are sadly over. We all now, it's kind of incumbent on all of us to think a little harder, dig a little deeper into what we're reading to really question if this is accurate or not. And it really creates an issue for journalists when we try to fact check of repeating the lie. If you want to fact check something and there was an untruth, how do I tell you about that without repeating what that untruth is? And it creates quite a conundrum. Carlos, how do you folks at the Post and how do you recommend that journalists deal with that issue?
Well, there's been a proliferation of organizations, both independent and within larger news organizations, that are trying to fact check, especially political statements. And Glenn Kessler, who some of you may have read, is the main fact checker at the Washington Post. He's really good at this because, in part, he had a million different beats. He's covered business and politics and diplomacy, so he's very familiar with a lot of different arenas of information. And he's the head of our fact-checking team. And but of course, when you're fact-checking some statement, I asked him about it this morning. I emailed him just to make sure I was conveying it correctly. You have to sort of state the disputed statement up front, to say this is what we're talking about. And of course, that means you end up repeating it. You end up repeating it like at the top of your story, right? And there's sort of no way around it. But at least, and the Post has this kind of gimmicky thing where he assigns Pinocchios. 4 Pinocchios is like, completely pants on fire, not true, One Pinocchio is like sort of shading the truth or whatever. People remember that. During the 2008 campaign, McCain would say like, Obama got 2 Pinocchios on that thing, And Glenn was very happy, our fact checker. But it does create a dilemma that you end up having to echo, a misstatement. But hopefully the way that we present it and then the way that we sort of dig into it, is we're able to show readers what it is that the truth really is, or at least the facts, right? Truth is for philosophers, right? Facts are for journalists. And I think that's the world we try to live in. Is you can't ignore the misstatements, you can't ignore the factually incorrect information, but you try to say, look, here are the facts as we have been able to discern and determine them. And it's up to you to get past reading just the headline and to actually go deeper into the story.
Right, and that's the tough thing for fact checking is you don't want to repeat the lie in the headline because we only read the headlines, right? And so it's a tightrope that Glenn and others have to walk, and how you do it, that still is elusive, I think.
See, I think that something that we've started doing at CNN, and some of my friends who are also journalists at other organizations have said, you guys are getting sassy with your Chirons on TV, because we'll say things like the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke. Zinke says he's a geologist, parentheses, he's not. Like he's not, but he studied geology in college, he's just never officially worked as a geologist, right? Things like that. We will say, President Trump says this, but actually, this, or whatever, it doesn't have to be Trump, it doesn't have to be someone from the administration. Nancy Pelosi says this, and so we try to fit it into the headline, or we try to fit it into the Chiron, because I work at CNN and I watch CNN on mute because I have other things going on, right? And so sometimes the Chiron might be the only thing that I see. So I can't just see and be exposed to, President Trump says this. So we're trying to kind of grapple with that both in digital and on TV. And I work on an analysis team. I work with Chris Saliza, who used to be at the Post and now works for CNN. And one thing that we try to do on our team is give context. And we try to go back and say, okay, President Trump, this is a story yesterday. President Trump says that he didn't fire Comey over the Russia thing. And then it's like, play the tape from that Lester Holt interview where he says something, literally says the Russia thing. So you're totally entitled to change your opinion as a politician, as a human. Things happen, news happens, you're allowed to evolve. But you're not allowed to say, I never said that, especially if you said it on tape.
Exactly. Today, Carlos, I noticed the Washington Post, they never repeated the lie, but they tweeted
I didn't
out.
read the Post today. I was here. I don't know.
I just read their tweet, so I've got 146 characters worth. But what they did today, they had FactCheck, and they had information about the president has made 3,251 false or misleading claims in 497 days. So that, I thought, was an interesting, very concise way to kind of fact check, and there was no repeating of a lie.
Right. And some of those, to be fair to the president, are repeats. They're not individually
It's
distinct,
best of, yes.
incorrect statements. There's some that he goes on at length about often. And there's different kinds of misstatements, right? There's, I didn't fire Comey over Russia. This was the largest tax cut in history, right? It's a big tax cut. It was not the largest tax cut in history. It was maybe like the 8th, which is still a big tax cut, right? There's kind of exaggeration, which is what in The Art of the Deal, he referred to this. I've read all of the books Trump wrote. And in The Art of the Deal, he referred to this as truthful hyperbole. Which is frankly, in the real estate world, is a thing. It's a sort of different kind of sensibility than in politics. But so Glenn Kessler and the fact-checking team at the Post tracks them. I think he reached the 3,000 misstatements mark in like early May.
Chris cited that.
I think. Yeah, in early May. And so they're, some of them are, they're not all sort of created equal. But that's a way to sort of show the magnitude of this. And again, I don't want to, we're doing this thing again. We're letting like Trump dominate everything, right? And all our conversations. But during the Obama administration, if you Bob Schieffer? Bob Schieffer, the guy, he was interviewed once and he said, whenever someone asks me what has been the worst administration to cover and the most antagonistic with the media, it's always the current one, right? It's always whoever it is. You mentioned the Committee to Protect Journalists. My former boss, Leonard Downey, who used to run the Washington Post, had this incredibly damning report about the relationship between Obama and the press. during that administration. They came out in 2015 or 2016. It's almost like each administration just sort of amps it up, takes the prior one as baseline and then moves forward.
Hold my beer, as the kids say.
Yeah.
Well, this isn't a new problem, I don't think, right? This is Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travel nearly 300 years ago. He said, falsehood flies and the truth come limping after, right? Have you seen the movie, what was the movie? It's called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We've seen that movie, right? That movie is about fake news. That movie is about misinformation, because Mr. Smith, he's on the Senate floor and he's doing his filibuster, talking, and then back home in Arizona, where he's from, it's just the newspapers are printing lies about Mr. Smith, right? This is not a new thing. I think it comes in cycles, and it will repeat itself. I think we're going to self-correct in the next few years. Somehow, with technology, it'll be different. I hope. It has to. Otherwise, we're all in trouble, I think. But I think it's going to self-correct a little bit. And then, in another generation, 20 more years, we'll go through it again, I think. But it's not a new problem. And so we're talking about Trump because that's the current administration, that's the current hot topic. But this goes back,
Right.
centuries.
Old problem kind of taken to a new level. We are pretty soon going to be opening things up for questions, but I do want to hear from all of you. And Tim, you just kind of gave us a prediction for the future, but I would love to hear from all of you on kind of where you think we're going. And I think absolutely most importantly for our audience members today, what can we do? We've talked about a few things, being more critical of what news we're taking in, but if you have any other concrete tips for our audience, I think we all would love to hear those. Brenna, why don't you start us off?
So one thing that I try to do when I have time is I look at the same story and how different outlets have written it. So whatever's leading CNN.com or the story that we're airing at the top of the hour every hour for the day, I'll look at how we wrote it, or I'll look at how we covered it, and then I'll look at how other news outlets have covered it, how Fox covered it, how NBC's covering it, how the blogs are covering it, and just see what is in there, and in certain stories, see what's left out, see what quotes are used, see what's not. And I just kind of try to synthesize that and make my own story, right? Choose your own adventure. Because I want to be as fully informed, and the internet doesn't have space limitations, but editors do. So you can't possibly fit everything into a story, right? So that's one thing that I like to do. It's kind of fun. You find new sources. And again, that's a good way to vet them, right?
Sure.
Is somebody, why wasn't, this is a crazy quote. Like, why wasn't this in everybody's story? And so well, maybe it didn't happen, right? So that's kind of my suggestion. And where we're going, I think that, like I said, I'm on this analysis team at CNN, and I think that analysis is something that's important and will become more important because there are so many outlets doing the same story. It's like, okay, well, what's the point? Conveniently, that's what my team is called. It's called The Point. So what's
branding?
Branding, hashtag branding.
Right.
So, what's the point, right? Like, what is the one thing that I want to take away from this story? And, you might not agree with every piece of analysis that you read. You shouldn't agree with every piece of analysis that you read. But I think the fact that we're starting to think more critically about these stories and really think about, like, what do I think about this? How does this impact me? I think that that's something, like you said, we are having to be more active in our news consumption. And that's not a bad thing, I think it's exciting. This is a crazy time in our industry, in our world, and being an active member of this society and this really great country, which is really great.
True.
It's an exciting opportunity, and it's good to have a new way to engage with it.
Carlos, thoughts for the future and tips for the audience on how they can engage with real news versus fake news versus news.
I know that it's like we're asking you to do all this work, right? And you all have jobs and kids and families and obligations and hobbies and tea times. And we don't, you rely on on journalists, on different news organizations as a shortcut, right? You know, like you want us to do the work, you want us to do the vetting, and we're here telling you have to do all this additional work and read multiple sources for everything.
I'm still a student at heart.
Yeah, but I think that one way to think about it is to think about the news organization that you're relying on, and then to really look at the story that you are consuming, whether you're reading it or watching it on TV or listening to it on the radio. Is the news organization, does it have a reputation for getting a lot of stuff wrong, or does it have a long track record? Do its stories eventually kind of bear out in the historical record? The Washington Post was heavily criticized during the Watergate era. Turns out most of the stuff was true.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler. There's a great book and a great movie if you haven't seen it. But can you find out who owns the organization, right? Can you look into the ownership? Can you look at where they get their money? Is that information available to you? Or is it a couple of guys with a webcam or something? Then when you look at the specific thing that you're reading, are the journalists transparent about how they obtain certain information? Do they provide documentary evidence with the story? Can you find something out about the people who are writing it? These are sort of quick shorthand ways to try to gauge even in a first cut the credibility of what you're reading. And I said this earlier. If you find yourself relying on a news source that just solely validates, exactly what you think politically, it's counterintuitive, but that's dangerous, right? Whatever side of the spectrum you're on, the truth is messier than that, and the facts are messier than that. Again, truth is for the philosophers, but right? You sort of mentioned the sneaky serpent in the newsfeed, right? What is truth, right? That was Pontius Pilate, right? Yes, thank you, sir. There are ways to try to get at the credibility of what you're reading without having to become a detective or a journalist yourself. It may be imperfect, but I think there are things you can do without having to have it consume all your time the way it does ours.
Sure. Tim, you already kind of gave us a prediction for the future, and I know that one thing that I am very vigilant about, especially when it comes to social media or online sites, there's so many news aggregator sites out there now, and you've really got to be careful about those. If they're picking up stuff from legitimate or non-legitimate places, just go straight to the source. Do yourself a favor. Tim, other thoughts on tips for our audience?
So on social media, I think one of the things that happens is that for most of us, when we sign up for an account on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, we sign up with a single, it doesn't cost us anything. It actually takes just like a few seconds. And the fact that identities are cheap or free online is one of the reasons this spreads. So if you could create 500 accounts and like something 500 times, then that gets bumped up in the algorithm and then spread around. And that's one of the ways that one of the reasons that we need to be critical of what we see as trending or at the top of our newsfeed is because the algorithm is deciding what it thinks that you think will be interesting and what brings you back to the site and generates ad revenue for the website. So I guess the punchline is be critical with what you share and like and read, especially on social media sites. Investigate the source, of course, but more than that is what is ranked first is not always the most true. Sometimes, like we've heard before, the truth is messy and facts will come to full light in several weeks down the road. I think we're going to self-correct. I think this comes in cycles. Right now it's a hot topic. That's why we're all here talking about it. Everyone's interested in it. But I think that we all have seen what can happen. It's a new technology, has a new spin to it, just like newspapers and movable type made printing newspapers really cheap and easy 100 years ago. So it's going to come in a cycle. I think we're going to self-correct. We're going to kind of immunize ourselves so that this doesn't continue to happen. I think it has to. Because if it doesn't, then, like I said before, we're all in trouble.
Well, on that happy note.
Yeah. Welcome to Notre Dame.
We were saying earlier, we don't want to bum everybody out because you're all here for such a fantastic weekend. And I do think that we all would agree that I think journalists are more committed than ever to getting through this and making sure that our audiences are well served. So please know that. And speaking of audiences, we would love to begin taking some of your questions. There are 2 microphones positioned here near the stage. And I would just encourage you to make sure that you do have a question for our panelists. If it's maybe a story or an anecdote, we're going to be hanging around afterwards, and we'd love to hear your stories and anecdotes then. But questions, now is the time. Sir, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you. I have so many questions I could monopolize this microphone.
Maybe one. Let's start with
so
one.
I'll go with what I think is the most important. I'm talking about economic issues now. I'm not talking about abortion. I'm not talking about same-sex marriage. Those social issues. On economic issues, I find our major media to be very orthodox, very pro-corporate, very careerist-oriented. And there seems to be a very narrow range or band of what are considered acceptable views on those issues. Are there factors that bear on reporters and journalists as far as what they can write about, what's considered an acceptable opinion that we can write about, and what's outside that range? That's one. And then another question I have is that once again there seems to be a pretty uniform pattern of media covering certain topics and running with them, like in the old days. Time and Newsweek magazines, you remember magazines, I think. At least I'm sure the audience does. They would always have the same cover story week after week after week, and you wonder, these are independent companies, how can they come up with the same story? So how do the major media companies determine what you're going to write about? What stories are you going to push and write about week after week or whatever? So those are my questions.
All right, thank you, sir. Carlos, want to get us started on that?
Sure. One of the things you mentioned is, what are the opinions that are within the acceptable range, right? And I think that's one thing to think about. At the Washington Post, for instance, there is a big, robust news gathering operation, and then there is a whole opinion, columnists, editorial side, and that side of the operation definitely has views, has views on whether free trade is a good thing, on whether tariffs are positive or negative, and they very forcefully present those views. And the editorial board has no problem, weighing in, pro or con. On the news side, we're in the news gathering more than opinion foisting business. And so there, right now, tariffs are going into effect, right? And other countries are retaliating against U.S. tariffs, and that's a huge story. That's something that people weren't expecting to be of us having to write about, say, if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency. And so I don't think that there are, for straight news reporters, there's nothing that is really out of bounds as to what we can cover. During the 2016 campaign, both on the Bernie Sanders side and on the Donald Trump side, the views on inequality, on economic inequality, it vastly expanded the scope of the debate that we'd had before in the United States, at least in recent years. And we went full force into those kinds of stories. So I don't think, there's no sort of memo that we get on a weekly basis saying like, here's the line to toe, or here's the things that we can write about. News reporters aren't that clever. There's no room, there's no time for the conspiracy. And so
one of the things I think that maybe the question might be getting to a little bit more, and to this point, is that the headline, though, doesn't, at least on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, it doesn't say opinion and then the headline. It just says the headline. And so, and that's the same thing on maybe on CNN or on Fox News and NBC. It's the news channel, but that particular segment is actually a commentary panel. And those lines get blurred a lot. So what is hard news and what is opinion gets all jumbled up in your news feed.
And you just end up seeing this was on the Washington Post or this was on CNN.
Right, it doesn't say this is my opinion. It just says news headline, right? And I think that's a reasonable point.
It's also it's a difficult time for media right now financially, in a business sense. The Washington Post is fortunate. We are owned not by Amazon, but by the owner of Amazon, by Jeff Bezos, who happens to be the richest man in the world. That's a good situation for the Washington Post. He does not dictate coverage. He does not come and tell us, you should write about this or write about that. If he did, the first people you would hear it from is Washington Post reporters who care deeply about their credibility and would be the first ones to break that story. Because the last thing the Washington Post wants is for the New York Times to break the story about how Jeff Bezos is dictating coverage. We would be the ones to do that, and people would leave. I mean, that's kind of the ethos of journalism. But local news is being decimated. You are in a world where big national news organizations are able to, either through ownership or through subscription models or what have you, are able to keep hiring, to keep expanding the reporting ranks. Local news, where real corruption happens, where real problems happen, that is disappearing. And that is, far more than the big national stories that you're hearing. Nothing is more corrupt than like an unsupervised, local, whether a state legislature or municipality, and without a robust local journalistic presence, that's a huge problem. Much more so than what's going on nationally, I think.
Yeah, we have a whole team at CNN who, a lot of what they do is look at, past radio interviews or past, even just like local media outlet interviews where they may have said something kind of wrong, racist, anti-Semite, anti-Muslim, and if there were more robust news organizations in these people's hometowns when they were state representatives or mayors, and they had called them out on that, then, we wouldn't be thinking about them as the next possible representative from Virginia's 12th district. I just made that number up. I'm sure those are very nice people, probably. I don't know.
Probably
we'll
like
find out. Go find out.
In here,
right?
yeah.
But if there were, like you said, local news is being decimated. Thank you for being here. Everyone should appreciate our local news journalists. And if you catch something before people, might get into larger positions of power, or you can check them, then that would be
we are all
ideal.
Better served by that, certainly. So thank you all for being so patient, and please don't give up. We're going to get to you at the microphones. Miss, please go ahead.
So Brenna, you were saying earlier that everyone can be a journalist in the sense that consumers should be discerning about the news they receive, but I think it's been a trend in the last 5 or 10 years that in a very literal way, the barriers to entry to be a journalist have gotten a lot smaller and a lot cheaper. One, because the internet is a free platform to anyone in the world in real time, but two, because the phones in our pockets are now HD quality. So the video that you can get is such a great quality, and I think we've all seen a lot of mobile rigs. As a result of that, there was a GoPro and a mic in the golf cart that I took with my luggage today because the Alumni Association wanted to get some quotes from people as an example. So as a result, do you think that now that people no longer have to rely on someone who can afford a newspaper, or there's no longer just a handful of TV news broadcast sources, now that there's millions of sources, how do you think that has positively and negatively affected not just journalism, but perhaps society and world history?
Well, I think that's exciting, right? I think the more sources you can have on something, again, I know not everybody has time to do all this, checking of 18 different sources, but, you can find a news source every day. You can find a writer that you like. You can find a writer who might not agree with you all the time, but I think that the fact that in and of itself is exciting, to have a lot of different kind of news outlets and different types of news outlets. But at the same time, the fact that a lot, it might be just somebody running a blog at their house, they might be very accessible via these same social media platforms. Tweet at them, follow them on Facebook, leave them a message, question them, the same way that you question, CNN or the Washington Post. But that's kind of cool that you can have that kind of access. If you tweet at me, I try to respond, right? And I think that journalists like engaging with people. We like, being challenged on things that we, feel very solid about. If you ask where did you get this, fact from, I'll say, here you go. Here's, where I got it. And I think we all try to be very candid. And I would hope that on every level, from the blogger, in La Fortune to, the New York Times, I would like to think that we all love what we do enough to want to engage with people who are taking time to read the things that we're writing.
If I could jump in
Yeah.
briefly, I think there's also some nefarious things that can happen with that. One of the things that we see with the hurricane in Puerto Rico or what happened in Haiti is that these individuals who are writing newspapers will, for I don't know why, they will tweet out, or they'll write a story that says the water depot is at the police station at 1st and Main. And there is no water at 1st and Main. But they'll just say, during disasters, Spread just lies. And I don't understand why, but trolling people in natural disasters deserves the worst kind of punishment, but is something that happens frequently, happens often, and has real-world consequences because they have an access and a platform to do that. And so you get the good with the bad. You get the HD video, but you also get people who just want to be bad actors.
I will also.
Sorry.
Sorry,
No,
Tim. I was going to say at the local level that we have come to rely on what we call the citizen journalist. Bad weather or tornadoes, send us your pictures, et cetera. And it does make for better coverage. I guess what I view as potentially the flip side of that is it makes it less necessary for us to be there because you're doing it for us. And so I can't say, oh, journalists have lost their jobs because people are sending us pictures with high quality cell phones, but it has changed the equation, certainly. Carlos, I'm sorry.
All I was going to say is early reports are almost always wrong, right? Whether it's the identity of the Boston Marathon bombers, right, or the identity of someone who commits violence at a school, that information is often incorrect, and it spreads so quickly. The other old line is, right, was it Mark Twain, right, that, a lie goes around the world before the truth gets its pants on or something, don't quote that, it's something like that. And it's probably not even Twain. But
did you just fake news Mark Twain?
Yeah, hashtag fake news. And yet, we rely so much on that information. One thing that has been revolutionary with the use of telephones and live video is the huge story about what happens during police stops and that sort of thing has been revolutionized because people have phones in their hands they can take video. Mm-hmm. And suddenly we see things that happen that we didn't see before, even if we read about them.
It's a powerful tool. Sir, your question. Thank you for waiting patiently.
You beat me to my point about the telephones, but people with hair like mine were there before the internet, and we didn't take anonymous phone calls. Everybody had signed their name to everything, and that's gone. But we should be a little bit optimistic, and I was going to say, and I'll just say it again, that even we now know when a phone call comes in, if we don't recognize the number, not to answer. So we're using some discretion, and you talked about autocorrect. So I just like to say I think there's hope. And finally, the screen says Sneaky Serpent in your news field. So I'll just leave you with this comment. There once was a very popular mayor in Chicago, Mayor Richard J. Daley. Probably most of the people in this room have heard of him. And he was famous for fracturing language. So one day he got all excited and he said, "They make these allegations, where are their alligators?"
Go ahead, your question,
Okay,
please.
2 quick questions. As far as your teaching goes, do you find to be
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, step a little closer.
Okay.
Thank you.
In terms of your teaching, do you find it to be optimistic or pessimistic in terms of where your students are on this whole phenomenon of fake news? Are they getting sucked into it and vulnerable? My second question, though, is as far as fact-checking. It seems that a lot of people are discounting that too, in terms of there's no such thing as a real objective fact. It's just your opinion. In other words, it's just, you can take the New York Times, the Washington Post, or your local newspaper reporting something, and the person you're talking to it's like talking to a blank wall because they'll say, well, no, wait a minute, you need to read something on the internet. So do you think maybe that's the root cause of just, like Kellyanne Conway said, well, there's alternative facts?
I mean,
Carlos, do you want to start with the students?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question.
my students are great.
Where were you this semester? I did the Washington program.
And they don't. You didn't take my class,
I
apparently.
took the class. Where were you?
What? I've been teaching it since 09. Yeah.
I didn't.
I haven't taken a semester off. I should. I'm very optimistic when I talk to my students because they're self-selected. They're so type A overachievers. They're just boundless energy, and it's exhausting. But they, the first day of class, I always ask them, A, what's your earliest political memory? And B, how do you get your news? Very few of them are like, oh, I subscribe to the print Washington Post or to the New York Times. It's a lot of aggregators. The skim if that's still a thing, that's very popular.
It's a thing.
Some of them, are very old school because their parents or grandparents get them subscriptions to things. They eventually get to something from the Post, perhaps, or from CNN or from the New York Times, but only because someone else kind of put it together in some kind of feed for them, whether it was on Facebook or whether it was some other aggregator service. But they're very well informed, and their sources end up being their way into the news is different from mine.
Yeah. The students at Notre Dame are the reason I'm hopeful. I see every year about 300 individual students. Now, most of them are computer scientists, so most of them are kind of nerds like me, and they investigate deeply. But I think just broadly speaking, I'm originally from Kansas. I got my PhD in Illinois, and then I'm here in Indiana. I think that the reason I think we're going to self-correct is because people, young and old, but especially the students, they understand that, okay, I have to be critical with, and I think that's one of the things we try to teach at Notre Dame, right, is critical thought. Right? Especially the reason we have theology and philosophy classes here, they're required to take them is so you can learn how to investigate deeply and think critically about a thing. Right, there's one person clapping from the audience. And that's the reason Notre Dame is such a great place to be. And we do our best to not teach you a point of view, but to teach you how to investigate your own point of view. And so that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful. I think we're going to self-correct because of people like the students here at Notre Dame.
Sir, your question.
To slightly extend your commentary, and to put a little note on, I hope there's a little more Notre Dame. We've talked about fake news as a sin of commission. I would like to know your perspectives on sins of omission, and while not trying to limit your expansive commentary, one of the ideas I thought about is, how do you spike a story?
That's a great question.
How do you what?
Spike a story.
Who wants to start with that one?
Yeah.
You
talked about a little earlier how you went and you looked at other people's coverage of stories, and you made a comment about how perhaps CNN didn't cover a story and MSNBC did. Mm-hmm. That's an example of CNN spiked a story.
Right. So I think, number one, we are a large organization, but there's always been so much news, even before the news cycle was every 5 minutes like it is now. Our fingers cannot type fast enough to cover every single thing. And we break out different, if Trump gives a speech, we try to break out the different pieces of news that are made if he says different things about different topics. But we can't possibly do a breakout story on every claim that's made. And we kind of have to think about, is this part of a larger kind of storyline? Is this really new news? Is this, we're trying to think about the news in a kind of holistic sense, right? And triage it, essentially. And so the people I work with have a ton of integrity, and I am very proud to work with them. never, and at every organization that I've worked at, never have I been in a room where someone said, I don't like that fact, we're not gonna write that story, you know? I've been in way more meetings where we've said, that's an interesting fact, let's check it. You know, I've been in meetings where we said, I don't think, you know, the president's getting enough credit for these job numbers. They're good, they're objectively good, we should say that, you know? MSNBC might not be saying that, or, you know, Fox News might not be talking about this, right? So, you know, we have to think about where we are in the media landscape. We have to look at, we do look at what our competitors are covering, but that doesn't drive what we cover, you know? We start in our newsroom and we go from there.
I think currently none of us have enough resources to get to all the stories that are out there in our current media landscape. And so if there are omissions to some extent, I think it's simply a lack of resources as opposed to a decision being made. Carlos, I don't know if you have anything from the Post you want to add regarding that.
One thing, it's a little different. One thing I would point out is, you know, there are instances where we deliberately will suppress certain information because we feel that revealing it could be damaging to national security, or it could endanger, could endanger, intelligence agents in the field, or could endanger American troops. And even if it's part of a significant news story, one example I always go over with my students is a few years, maybe like 10 years ago, the Washington Post revealed that the CIA in the early post 9/11 era had essentially established kind of what they called black sites, these secret prisons in different parts of the world, where they would take suspected terrorists for interrogations. And the CIA doesn't know how to do that. They're not jailers. That's not what they're trained for. It's not what they're prepared for. And so it created a lot of problems in the way this whole thing was managed. One of our reporters, Dana Priest, who was one of our most talented intelligence reporters, broke that story. She never revealed the names of the countries because that would create a whole set of damaging, problems for the countries involved, for relationships, for revealing methods and sources of intelligence. We knew the names of the countries. Other reporters who followed up on that wrote the names of the countries. The Washington Post never did, because we felt that was something that wasn't, we said it was like in Eastern Europe, right? Or in Southeast Asia, or wherever they were. And that's an instance where we purposely withheld information, but not out of some kind of like agenda, but rather because we're not in the business of willy-nilly revealing information that could damage American national security. Now, most of the time, when politicians say you can't reveal that because it'll damage national security, that's not true. Usually it's, you can't reveal that because that would be embarrassing for us, right? And it's not our job to keep anyone from feeling embarrassed. But we will, sometimes we don't cover things because there's no time, which is a daily struggle. But often we won't publish something for very deliberate reasons, and we go through deep negotiations or conversations, sometimes with an administration, where they're trying to tell us, you can't publish a story at all, and in the end you kind of learn, well, explain why, what's the argument? And if they make a persuasive argument, then we will hold back on parts of the story. And that happens every day, above my pay grade.
Thank you. Sir, your question.
Yes, I have a question about your journalism background, your education. But first, I just read last year a short biography of Grant Lee, Robert E. Lee, and Ulysses S. Grant. And it was something in the Lee story that was kind of, it was after the war, he went back to Virginia, and some businessmen decided to create a college, and they asked him, he was not employed anymore because he lost the war. And so they asked him to become president. And at that time, Washington College in Virginia was a very small college, startup. And after a few years, he was very intimately connected with the students and the faculty and so on, because he's small. And so he introduced journalism as a course of study for the first time, supposedly in this story that I read. And I'd like you to fact check that. He introduced journalism. And it doesn't say why he did this, but I suspect, at that time, Civil War time, every little jerkwater town had a newspaper, and everybody that printed anything lied, right? So, lying was really big at that time. So I don't know whether his purpose was to give standards to journalists, and I want to ask you what your standards are, what you learned in the course of studying journalism.
All right, standards and what we learned in the course of studying journalism. I'll start with our most recent student, Brenna.
So I was not a journalism major or minor. I still don't think we have a journalism major here. We do have the minor. I did not do the minor. I was an FTT major, so film, television, theater. My focus was television. And so I kind of got all of my journalism experience while I was in college while doing internships in Washington mostly. I did a short stint at the Home Shopping Network, which I learned a lot there too. But
More viewers than you'll ever have.
seriously. Yes. The world of home retail is a whole different beast. Happy to talk about it afterward. But I think that the thing that I learned, we talked about how Notre Dame teaches you critical thinking. By the classes that we're required to take philosophy and theology where there might not be facts, right? Where we kind of have to find our own facts and what that means in those realms. I think that really helped me. I still write. I do a lot of kind of throwback, here's a historical parallel to what's going on now stories. That's because history's a thing that I really enjoy, and CNN kind of lets me run with it. But I research those the same way I researched papers here. I use those, and I think a lot about making good arguments, supporting them with facts, supporting them with multiple sources that I trust that say the same thing. If I see on one place that says something different, a different number, a different year or something, I go as deep into a primary source as I can. Primary sources were huge in my classes here. So I think that's helped me a lot. I didn't get any formal journalism training here, but those foundations, those solid kind of liberal arts foundations, will help me for the rest of my life.
Carlos.
I also did not study journalism. I never thought I'd be any kind of writer. I studied economics and political science at Notre Dame. I did a master's degree in public policy. And then I just sort of fell into journalism because I found economics and banking to be really boring. And so I moved into journalism. And really, the best journalism education you can get is just to spend time in a newsroom. And at the Washington Post, I've learned from extraordinary journalists. And the standards, it's not enough for something to be true, but you got to be able to prove it. Like there are things that you know to be true, but can you show them to be true is a very different standard. And once you clear those two standards, then how relevant is it to what you're trying to report? And so is it true? Can you prove it? Does it matter? Is it relevant? Is it consequential? Those are sort of the kind of basic core standards that at least help you get through the day.
You might not think of it, but my first job was as a journalist. When I was 16 years old, I had a job in a newsroom in Hutchinson, Kansas. I wrote the obituaries. And but I spend most of my days now just doing long division on the whiteboard. So I'm no longer a journalist.
Please tell us your question. Dolly's got the assist on the mic.
Yeah. When you said that when that woman lied about having had a relationship with Roy Moore, or then you found out that it was a lie, and then you published a story about it being a lie. How do people trying to denounce newspapers? How does that affect what the newspapers publish?
Carlos?
That's a phenomenal question.
This is my son.
All right.
That's a really good question. And what you're getting at, Jamie, is the kind of human aspect of working as a journalist all day, right? because people often forget that there's a person behind the byline. And when you click on the story, what's amazing, I get emails, which I've shown you some of them, from readers who say really mean things to me, right? When they don't like something that I wrote. And others who say wonderful things to me. And all that really means is that what I wrote conformed to one person's point of view and not to the other person's point of view. And sometimes when I respond to the nasty ones, they're shocked. And they're like, I didn't really, thanks. Like, no, it was great, And they forget, that's when they suddenly realize there's a person there. It's not just some random email account, which is what they think. Most people think that it's going to an email account that no one's ever going to open or read. But when you see that there's a person behind that story or that byline, then you can actually have a conversation with someone, which is really what it's about. But it's hard. It's hard when you see that people are trying to trick you, or that people always assume the worst motives behind what you're trying to do. You must have some agenda. You must be out to get somebody, or you must be trying to help somebody else. And that's hard. It's a hard way to go through your day. Most of the people who work in the world don't have jobs where, people outside of that company or that place are constantly questioning their motives and their ethics and their views. But that's what journalism has become a little bit, and that's weird. One thing I would recommend to everyone, there's a wonderful series right now that's airing on Showtime called The Fourth Estate, and it's a documentary crew embedded with the New York Times, mainly the Washington Bureau of the Times, from Inauguration Day through the first year of the Trump presidency. And you see people, editors, writers, videographers, trying to get at the facts, trying to get at the truth. And when you see that it's just kind of regular people who are struggling every day to get at certain kind of information, I think those things would happen less. I think when you realize that it's not just some big block of cement company, but that it's people like Brenna who are just trying to do their job every day, I hope that it would be less antagonistic. Maybe that's too optimistic, but I hope so. Thank you.
Folks, we have reached the point in the program, and hold on, before everybody's like, no, it was just my turn. Our panelists have graciously agreed to hang out for a little bit, and so for those of you who waited so patiently, please, we encourage you to stay, chat with us afterwards. So don't give up. We're going to hang around for a little bit. But at this time, first off, I want to thank our amazing panelists. We've had an amazing discussion this morning.